At 8:12 on a Wednesday morning, I woke up and realized my wife's dog was gone. It wasn't an immediate panic. Walter was 14 years old, a golden retriever mix, whose joints had stiffened with age, and his morning routine was usually very predictable. He would sleep on the rug next to my side of the bed, slowly heave himself up around 7:30, and make a slow, clicking journey down the hardwood hallway to wait by the back door. But this morning, the rug was empty. The house was utterly, oppressively silent. I pushed myself out of bed, my 70-year-old knees popping slightly, and walked out into the hallway. "Walter?" I called out, my voice thick with sleep. There was no answering click of claws on the hardwood. There was no heavy, rhythmic thumping of a tail against a wall. I checked the living room. He was not asleep under the large oak coffee table. He was not curled up beside the old, faded blue armchair where my wife, Margaret, used to sit and read to him when her hands were too weak from the chemotherapy to hold a book for long. The space beside the chair was empty. A cold, uneasy feeling began to settle in my chest. I walked into the kitchen. Gone. Not just missing from the room. Gone in a way that felt violently deliberate. His heavy red leash was missing from the iron hook by the back door. His food and water bowls, the heavy ceramic ones that had sat in the same corner of the kitchen for over a decade, were no longer there. I opened the pantry door and found them washed, dried, and stacked neatly on the bottom shelf, pushed to the back as if they had never been used, as if a dog had never lived in this house. I walked out to the mudroom, my heart now pounding a steady, hard rhythm against my ribs. His bed was gone, his blanket. The soft, incredibly heavy wool blanket that Margaret had spent 3 months knitting during her last winter was no longer folded neatly in his sleeping corner. I found it shoved into a black plastic trash bag near the door to the garage, tied off with a tight, dismissive knot. I stood in the mudroom, staring at the black trash bag, the coldness in my chest spreading into my throat. "Daniel!" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. I turned and walked quickly back into the kitchen. "Daniel, where is Walter?" My son walked into the kitchen from the front hallway. His wife, Vanessa, was a few steps behind him. They had let themselves in with their spare key, something they had been doing more and more frequently since Margaret passed away 8 months ago. Daniel was dressed in a sharp business casual suit, holding a travel mug of coffee. Vanessa was wearing her designer workout clothes, holding a clipboard and looking around the kitchen with a critical, appraising eye. Neither of them looked surprised by my panic. Neither of them looked concerned. They looked inconvenienced. That was when I knew. "Dad," Daniel said, setting his coffee mug on the counter. He used the careful, measured voice that people use when they have already done something completely unforgivable and want you to call it practical. It was time. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the words. "Time for what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Vanessa sighed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest. The clipboard tapped against her hip. "That dog was old, smelly, and confused, Harold," Vanessa said, speaking to me as if I were a particularly slow child. "He was ruining the hardwood floors with his accidents, and he was making this house incredibly depressing. We can't even have guests over without the entire place smelling like a veterinary clinic." My hands went completely cold. "Where is he?" I asked, looking directly at my son. Daniel shifted his weight, looking away from my eyes. He looked out the window at the neatly trimmed backyard where Walter used to chase tennis balls before his hips gave out. "We took him to a shelter, Dad," Daniel said flatly. "First thing this morning. It's done." The kitchen felt as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of it. I had buried my wife 8 months earlier. I had held her hand as she took her last breath in a hospital bed that smelled of antiseptic and defeat. Since that day, I had slept with her side of our bed completely untouched. I had kept her worn gray cardigan draped over the back of the blue chair in the living room, because every single night before he went to sleep, Walter would walk over and press his graying muzzle against it, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of the woman who had saved him. And my son, my own flesh and blood, had just taken the last living creature who still waited for her footsteps and dropped him behind a stranger's door. "Mom is gone, Dad," Daniel said, his voice hardening slightly, as if my silence was a sign of stubbornness. "The dog was just making you sad. You're stuck in this house, living in the past, taking care of an animal that is barely clinging to life. We did you a favor." I stared at him. My boy. Her boy. The child Margaret had stayed awake with through countless fevers, nightmares, and teenage heartbreaks. The boy she had driven to hockey practice at 5 in the morning. The man she had proudly watched walk down the aisle to marry Vanessa. He was standing in her kitchen, telling me that erasing her dog was a favor. "No," I said quietly. I walked over to the kitchen island. Resting the fruit bowl was Walter's thick leather collar. They must have taken it off him before they dropped him off, perhaps thinking that a dog without a collar would be easier to process, easier to abandon as a stray. I picked it up. The brass tag jingled softly in the quiet kitchen. "Walter was not making me sad," I said, looking down at the worn leather. "He was helping me survive it." "Harold, please," Vanessa groaned, rolling her eyes. "It's a dog. He was barely moving. He didn't even know where he was half the time. You need to focus on moving forward, not clinging to a dying animal." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't throw them out of my house, though every nerve in my body was screaming at me to do exactly that. I just turned and walked into the living room, leaving them standing in the kitchen. I walked over to the blue armchair, sitting down heavily on the edge of the cushion. I held Walter's collar in my hands, tracing the familiar indentations in the leather. My memory drifted backward, slipping away from the cold reality of the morning and returning to a rainy afternoon 12 years ago. Margaret had walked through the front door, soaking wet, holding a large, shivering, golden-furred mutt by a piece of rope. "Harold," she had said, her eyes bright and defiant, despite the rain dripping from her nose. "This is Walter. They were going to put him down at the county shelter at 3 o'clock today. I got there at 2:45. Walter had been a wreck back then. He was severely underweight, terrified of loud noises, and had a nasty scar across his back leg from an old injury. For the first 2 months, he wouldn't let me within 5 feet of him. But he bonded with Margaret instantly. He became her shadow. Where she went, Walter followed. When she gardened, he lay in the dirt beside the rose bushes. When she cooked, he sat by the oven, patiently waiting for a dropped carrot or a piece of cheese. And when the cancer came, when the house filled with the terrible, quiet dread of an unwinnable war, Walter never left her side. During the worst weeks of her chemotherapy, when the nausea was so bad Margaret couldn't bear the smell of food, and the pain made it impossible for her to sleep, Walter would lie on the floor right beside her bed. He wouldn't ask for walks. He barely ate. He just lay there, a solid, breathing anchor in a room that was slowly filling with ghosts. When Margaret lost the strength to walk down the stairs, Walter stopped going down them too, except to quickly relieve himself in the yard before sprinting back up to her door. He did not understand death, but he understood devotion. A month before she passed away, Margaret had asked me to help her sit up in the blue armchair. Walter immediately rested his heavy head on her knees. Margaret had gently stroked his ears, her hands thin and trembling. She had looked up at me, her eyes clear and uncomfortably sharp. "Harold," she had whispered, her voice fragile but firm. "Promise me." "Anything, Maggie," I had replied, holding her hand. "Promise me you will take care of him. When I am gone, he is going to be so confused. He is going to wait for me, Harold. He won't understand why I'm not coming home." "I promise," I said, fighting back tears. "I'll take care of him, always." Margaret had nodded, but she hadn't let go of my hand. She looked past me toward the hallway, a deep, knowing sorrow in her eyes. "If anyone ever calls Walter a burden, Harold," Margaret had said quietly, the words carrying a strange, heavy weight that I didn't fully understand at the time. Listen carefully, they may not be talking about the dog. Sitting in the blue armchair 12 years later, holding Walter's collar, I finally understood what she had meant. Margaret had known. She had known that grief is messy and aging is inconvenient. She had known that when people become fragile, they require patience, time, and sacrifice. And she had known, deep down, that our son had married a woman who viewed sacrifice as a poor financial decision, and that Daniel was too weak to stand up to her. They hadn't just thrown Walter away because he was old and smelled like a veterinary clinic. They had thrown him away because he was a practice run. If they could so easily dispose of the dog Margaret had loved more than anything in the world, simply because he was a depressing inconvenience, it wouldn't be long before they looked at me and made the exact same calculation. I looked down at the brass tag on the collar. Walter, if lost, call Harold, and on the back, etched in Margaret's neat, looping handwriting, he knows the way home Daniel had taken him. My son had driven my wife's dog to a shelter, signed a piece of paper, and walked away. He had done it because he thought I was too old and too paralyzed by grief to stop him. He thought he was clearing the house of a burden. My son thought he had taken an old dog to a shelter. He had no idea he had just answered the last question his mother ever left him. I remained in the blue armchair long after Daniel and Vanessa had retreated to the kitchen. The physical shock of Walter's absence had settled into a deep, hollow ache in my chest, but my mind was beginning to work with a cold, terrifying clarity. Margaret had always told me that people rarely do terrible things for no reason. They do them because they have convinced themselves the terrible thing is necessary for their own survival. I sat quietly, listening to the muffled voices drifting down the hallway. Daniel and Vanessa hadn't left yet. They were moving around in the kitchen, opening cabinets and running the faucet, likely continuing their unauthorized purge of my life. I stood up, walking silently down the carpeted hallway until I reached the edge of the kitchen wall. "We need to get the Stanley steamer guys in here by Friday," Vanessa was saying, her voice sharp and practical. I could hear the sound of her clipboard tapping against the granite counter. "That dog smell is baked into the baseboards. We cannot sell a house that smells like grief and dog hair." The realtor specifically said, "The first impression has to be immaculate." Sell a house. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't move. I held my breath, pressing my back against the wall. "I know, Van," Daniel said, his voice carrying the heavy, exhausted tone of a man who had not slept well in months. "But can we just slow down for a minute? I just dropped my mother's dog at a kill shelter. Dad looked like I had just shot him. I feel sick." "You'll feel sicker when the bank calls the note on your business loan, Daniel," Vanessa shot back, her tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "We don't have time to slow down. The personal guarantee on your renovation business is due in 60 days. If you don't inject capital into that LLC, they are going to come after our house. Our actual house, the one your children sleep in." I closed my eyes. Daniel's home renovation business. He had started it 5 years ago with a massive loan, convinced he was going to flip luxury properties in the suburbs. Margaret had warned him against taking on so much leverage, but Daniel had never liked listening to his mother when she told him things he didn't want to hear. The business had been bleeding money for 2 years. "I know the numbers, Vanessa," Daniel snapped, his stress finally boiling over. "But this is my dad's house. It's Mom's house, too. Your mother is gone, Daniel," Vanessa said flatly. The sheer coldness of the statement made my stomach turn. Equity isn't grief, money. There is $800,000 of clear equity sitting in these walls. And your father is wandering around talking to a dying dog while we are drowning. We need his half to pay off the bank, and we need our half to keep our lives afloat. He's not just going to leave, Van. He loves this place. He will leave if he realizes he can't manage it alone." Vanessa replied smoothly, her voice dropping into the soothing, manipulative register she usually reserved for client negotiations. That's why the dog had to go first. As long as he had Walter to take care of, he had a purpose, he had an excuse to stay. Once the dog is gone, your father will be easier to move. The silence that followed was suffocating. I waited for my son to object. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for the boy I had raised to realize that his wife was talking about dismantling his father's life, the way a mechanic talks about stripping a car for parts. "I'll call the carpet cleaners," Daniel said quietly. I turned around and walked back to the living room. I didn't confront them. Confrontation requires an expectation that the other person is capable of shame, and I had just learned that my son and his wife had entirely pawned theirs to save a failing business. 10 minutes later, the front door clicked shut. Their car engine started, and they backed out of the driveway, heading off to whatever brunch or meeting they had scheduled for the morning, completely confident that they had just solved their biggest financial problem. The house was silent again. I sat down on the edge of the sofa, looking at the empty hook by the back door where Walter's leash used to hang. I had known they were worried about money, but I hadn't realized the depth of their desperation. I hadn't realized that my grief was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing between them and a real estate transaction. Vanessa had been planting brochures for luxury assisted living communities on my coffee table for a month, claiming she just wanted me to know my options so I wouldn't be lonely. I had thought she was being overbearing. I hadn't realized she was staging a hostile takeover of my life. I reached for my phone on the side table. I needed to call the local shelters. I didn't know which one Daniel had taken him to, but I knew I had to find him. Walter was 14. He had arthritis. He needed a specific brand of softened food. If he sat in a concrete cage surrounded by barking dogs, his heart would simply give out from the sheer terror of abandonment. Before I could dial the first number, my phone buzzed in my hand. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but the location read, "Riverside County," I answered immediately. "Hello? Hello, is this Harold Bennett?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded young, but her tone was incredibly serious, carrying the tight professionalism of someone who dealt with difficult situations on a daily basis. "This is Harold," I said, my grip tightening on the phone. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Clara Ruiz. I'm a senior intake coordinator at the Riverside Animal Shelter," she said. "I'm calling about a senior golden retriever mix that was surrendered to our facility about 40 minutes ago." My chest seized. "Walter. Is he there? Is he okay?" "He is physically unharmed, Mr. Bennett, but he is extremely distressed," Clara replied, her voice softening slightly. "He's shaking pretty badly. We've put him in a quiet observation room away from the general population runs." "I'm coming to get him," I said immediately, standing up from the sofa. "My son brought him there without my permission. I am his owner. I am coming right now." "I need you to come down here, sir, but there is something you need to know first," Clara said, stopping me before I could walk toward the door. "What is it?" I asked. "Did he bite someone?" "He's never bitten anyone in his life, he's just scared." "No, Mr. Bennett, he didn't bite anyone," Clara assured me. "When your son brought the dog in, he filled out a standard owner surrender form. He claimed the dog belonged to his late mother, and that you, the surviving spouse, were being moved into an assisted living facility and could no longer care for the animal." I closed my eyes. The sheer audacity of the lie was staggering. Daniel had not only abandoned the dog, but he had legally documented his intention to force me out of my home. "That is a lie," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound sadness. "I am perfectly capable of caring for him, and I am not leaving my home." "I figured as much, sir," Clara said dryly. "Because standard procedure for an owner surrender involves scanning the animal for a microchip to verify the records. We scanned Walter 5 minutes ago." "I know he's chipped," I said. "My wife had it done 10 years ago. It should have my name and my cell phone number on it." It does have your name as the primary emergency contact, Clara confirmed. But that is not why I am calling you. There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of a dog barking in the background and the shuffling of paperwork. Mr. Bennett, dogs get abandoned here every day, Clara said, her voice dropping into a hushed, incredulous tone. People surrender senior dogs because they are moving, because they don't want to pay vet bills, or because they just bought a new puppy. We see a lot of heartless things in this building. I can imagine, I murmured. But I have been doing this job for 8 years, Clara continued, and I have never seen a microchip registry profile with a legal trust alert attached to it. I frowned, freezing in the middle of the living room. A what? A legal trust alert, Clara repeated. When I scanned Walter's chip, our system immediately pulled up a locked legal alert in the registry. The registration doesn't just list you as the contact. It lists the dog as protected under the Margaret Bennett Pet Care Trust. My breath caught in my throat. Margaret, the note attached to the chip is very specific, Clara read from her computer screen. It states that Walter is not to be surrendered, transferred, or euthanized without the explicit notarized consent of Harold Bennett. It also states that if Walter is surrendered to any facility by anyone other than Harold Bennett, it is to be treated as a hostile seizure of a protected trust asset. I stood completely still, staring at the empty blue armchair. Margaret had always been meticulous. She had managed our finances, organized our lives, and seen the world with a sharp, unforgiving clarity. She had known Daniel was weak. She had known Vanessa was greedy. But I had never imagined she would go to these lengths. She hadn't just asked me to promise to take care of Walter. She had built a legal fortress around him. Clara, I said, my voice barely a whisper. What else does the note say? The final instruction on the microchip alert is a direct order for the shelter staff, Clara said, her voice tight with anticipation. It says, do not release this animal to the surrenderer. Call Harold Bennett immediately. Then, instruct Mr. Bennett to contact attorney Evelyn Price to execute the forfeiture clauses of the family estate. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with legal dynamite. Forfeiture clauses. Margaret hadn't just protected the dog. She had rigged a trap. She had known that whoever threw Walter away would be the same person trying to throw me away. And she had ensured that the moment they tried, they would lose everything. Clara lowered her voice, speaking to me not as a shelter worker, but as someone who realized they were holding the pin to a very large grenade. Mr. Bennett, Clara said quietly, Walter is safe here with me. But you need to call your attorney right now, because whoever brought this dog in here today has absolutely no idea what they just triggered. The drive to the Riverside Animal Shelter was a blur of rain and adrenaline. I didn't bother changing out of my house shoes. I just grabbed my keys, walked out into the cold morning air, and drove the speed limit with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. My mind was racing, trying to process the sheer, terrifying scope of what Margaret had done. She had left a loaded gun disguised as a microchip, and our son had just pulled the trigger. The shelter was a low, cinder-block building on the edge of the industrial park. As I walked through the double glass doors, the smell of industrial bleach and wet fur hit me instantly. A young woman in blue scrubs was standing behind the reception desk. She looked up as I approached, taking in my disheveled appearance and the frantic look in my eyes. Mr. Bennett? She asked softly. I'm here for Walter, I said, my voice tight. I'm Harold Bennett. Clara nodded, stepping out from behind the desk. He's right back here. Follow me. She led me down a short, brightly lit hallway. Away from the deafening cacophony of the main kennel runs, she stopped in front of a small, quiet observation room with a glass door. I looked through the glass. Walter was lying on a thin blue mat in the corner of the room. He looked so incredibly small. His golden fur was dull under the harsh fluorescent lights, and he was shivering, a fine, continuous tremor running through his arthritic legs. He was staring blankly at the wall, looking completely lost. "He's been like that since they brought him in," Clara said quietly. "He wouldn't take any treats. He just lay down and started shaking." "Open the door," I said, my throat aching. Clara unlocked the door and pulled it open. I didn't hesitate. I dropped to my knees on the cold linoleum floor, not caring about my joints. "Walter," I whispered. The old dog's ears twitched. He turned his head slowly, his cloudy brown eyes trying to focus on the shape in the doorway. For a second, he just stared. And then, he recognized me. He didn't bark. He didn't jump up. He simply let out a low, ragged whine that sounded like a sob. And he dragged himself across the floor, pushing his heavy, graying muzzle directly into the center of my chest. I wrapped my arms around his thick neck, burying my face in his fur. He smelled like fear and shelter bleach, but underneath it all, he still smelled like my house. He still smelled like Margaret's cardigan. "I've got you, buddy," I whispered, tears finally spilling hot down my cheeks. "I'm here. I'm right here. You're never coming back to a place like this. I promise you." Walter let out a long, shuddering sigh, his body finally going limp against me as the shaking slowly began to subside. I stayed on the floor with him for 10 minutes, just holding him, letting him know that his world hadn't ended. When I finally stood up, my knees screaming in protest, Clara was standing in the doorway, holding a small plastic bag. "He had this on when they brought him in," Clara said, handing me the bag. "The man who surrendered him took it off and threw it in the lobby trash can on his way out. I pulled it out after the microchip scanned. I looked inside the bag. It was Walter's heavy leather collar. They removed his collar because they thought it made him easier to abandon. They thought it stripped him of his identity. They forgot it had my name on it. And they forgot it had Margaret's handwriting etched into the brass. "Thank you, Clara," I said, my voice hardening as I pulled the collar out and fastened it back around Walter's neck. The familiar jingle of the brass tag echoed in the small room. "For everything." "You're welcome, Mr. Bennett," Clara said, her professional demeanor returning, though her eyes were sympathetic. "As far as the county is concerned, this dog was never legally surrendered. You are the registered owner, and you are taking him home." "But," she hesitated, looking at the microchip scanner on the wall. "The trust warning, sir. It generated an automated email to the law firm listed on the chip. Attorney Evelyn Price, you really need to call her." "I will," I said, "as soon as I get him home." I drove Walter back to the house. He slept the entire way, his head resting heavily on the center console, his breathing deep and exhausted. When we walked through the front door, he didn't go to his food bowl. He didn't ask to go out to the yard. He walked slowly into the living room, circled the blue armchair twice, and lay down with a heavy sigh, pressing his nose against the hem of Margaret's cardigan. He was home. I walked into the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea, trying to steady my nerves before I called Evelyn. As I set the kettle on the stove, I noticed something sitting on the kitchen island. It was the clipboard Vanessa had been holding earlier that morning. In her haste to get to her brunch and escape the tension of dropping the dog at the shelter, she had left it behind. I normally wouldn't snoop through someone else's belongings, but the phrase, "Once the dog is gone, your father will be easier to move," was still ringing in my ears like a fire alarm. I picked up the clipboard and flipped it open. It wasn't a work document, it was a dossier. The top page was titled, *Bennett House, Prep Timeline. Beneath it was a meticulously detailed checklist. 1. Remove dog. Done. 2. Stanley Steamer. Friday 3. Realtor walkthrough 4. Harold transition. Target 14 days. I flipped to the next page. It was a glossy, high-end brochure for Sunset Pines Senior Living, a facility located almost 40 miles away from my neighborhood. Clipped to the brochure was a printed Excel spreadsheet. It was a budget. It detailed the estimated sale price of my house, the subtraction of the realtor fees, and the division of the remaining equity. My half was earmarked for the entrance fee to Sunset Pines. Daniel's half, nearly $400,000, was listed next to a line item that read, "Business loan payoff, clear personal guarantee." I stared at the spreadsheet, a sickening wave of betrayal washing over me. Daniel wasn't just planning to sell my house. He was planning to liquidate my entire life to bail himself out of a bad business decision. He was going to stick me in a facility 40 miles away, surrounded by strangers. Without my dog, without my memories, and without my home, also he wouldn't have to face bankruptcy. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from Daniel. "Dad, come to dinner tonight at our place. 7 o'clock. We need to talk like a family. They were going to do it tonight. The dog was gone. The carpets were scheduled to be cleaned. And now it was time to put the pressure on the grieving widower to sign away the deed to his house." I didn't reply to the text. Instead, I dialed the number for Evelyn Price. Evelyn was a sharp, no-nonsense estate attorney who had been friends with Margaret for 20 years. She picked up on the first ring. "Harold," Evelyn said, her voice completely devoid of its usual warmth. She sounded like a general preparing for war. "I received the automated alert from Riverside County this morning. Did you get the dog?" "I have him," I said, looking into the living room at Walter's sleeping form. "He's safe." "Good," Evelyn said. "Are you at the house?" "Yes." "I need you to come to my office right now, Harold. Bring Walter with you. Use the private entrance in the back." "Evelyn, what did Margaret do?" I asked, my voice tight. "She did exactly what she hired me to do, Harold," Evelyn replied grimly. "She built a failsafe. Get here as fast as you can." 30 minutes later, Walter and I walked into Evelyn's plush, mahogany-paneled office. Walter immediately found a patch of sunlight near the window and lay down, exhausted by the trauma of the morning. Evelyn was sitting behind her large desk. Sitting perfectly centered on the leather blotter was a thick dark green folder. "Sit down, Harold," Evelyn said gently, gesturing to the leather chair across from her. I sat down, placing Vanessa's clipboard on my lap. Evelyn looked at Walter, a sad, knowing smile crossing her face. Then she looked at me, her expression turning strictly professional. "When Margaret received her terminal diagnosis, she came to see me," Evelyn began, folding her hands over the green folder. "She was worried about you, Harold. She knew that grief can make people passive. And she knew that Daniel was married to a woman who viewed family as a financial transaction." Evelyn opened the folder. The first document was titled, *Margaret Bennett Pet Care and Family Conduct Trust. "She didn't just leave Walter a few $1,000s for vet bills," Evelyn explained, tracing the title with her pen. "She made him a protected legal entity under the estate. And she tied his welfare directly to Daniel's inheritance." I blinked, trying to follow the legal mechanics. "She tied my son's inheritance to the dog?" "Yes," Evelyn said firmly. "Margaret included a very specific family conduct amendment in the trust. It stipulates that Daniel is a future beneficiary of the estate's remaining liquid assets, but only on the condition that he acts in good faith toward you and toward Walter." Evelyn turned to the second page. "The conditions are explicit, Harold. If Daniel or his spouse abandons Walter at a shelter, if they attempt to force you into an assisted living facility against your will, or if they plot to sell the primary residence while you are still alive." Evelyn looked up, her eyes piercing. "Their beneficiary status is immediately and indefinitely suspended, pending a formal review by the trustee, which is you." I looked down at the clipboard in my lap, the checklist, the assisted living brochure, the budget. "They did all three," I whispered, the reality of it crashing over me. "In one morning, they did all three." "I know," Evelyn said. "The microchip alert triggered the first violation. When a protected asset is hostilely surrendered, the trust automatically freezes all future disbursements to the offending party." "Daniel doesn't know," I said, thinking of the text message. "He thinks he's just clearing the house to sell it. He wants me to come to dinner tonight. He said we need to talk like a family." "Of course he did," Evelyn scoffed. He thinks you are weak, Harold. He thinks you are grieving and easily manipulated. He thinks he can sit you down at a dinner table, present you with a glossy brochure, and pressure you into signing away your home to save his business. I handed Vanessa's clipboard across the desk. Evelyn took it, her eyes scanning the checklist and the budget. Her jaw tightened as she read the line item about paying off Daniel's business loan with my equity. This is exactly what she was afraid of, Evelyn said, her voice thick with disgust. Margaret knew that people reveal their true character when something helpless becomes inconvenient. Evelyn closed the green folder and pushed it across the desk toward me. You are going to go to that dinner tonight, Harold, Evelyn said, her eyes flashing with a predatory legal brilliance. You are going to let them make their pitch. You are going to let them present their brochures and their budgets. And then? I asked, resting my hand on the heavy folder. And then, Evelyn said, I am going to walk through the door with Walter and the trust officer, and we are going to show your son exactly what his mother thought of his priorities. Evelyn placed Margaret's folder between us. Harold, she said softly, looking at the exhausted golden retriever sleeping in the sunlight. Walter was not the only one this trust was written to protect. The family planning dinner was held in the dining room of Daniel and Vanessa's modern, aggressively minimalist house. When I arrived at 7 o'clock, the table was already set with expensive linen napkins and crystal wine glasses. The air smelled of roasted rosemary and forced hospitality. But it wasn't just Daniel and Vanessa waiting for me. Sitting at the table were two strangers. Dad, I'm glad you came, Daniel said, stepping forward to take my coat. His smile was tight and nervous, his eyes flicking briefly toward the strangers before returning to me. I wanted to introduce you to some people who can help us figure out the next steps. I walked into the dining room, my expression carefully blank. Harold, it is so good to see you, Vanessa said, pouring a glass of red wine and pushing it toward an empty seat. This is Mark. He's a premier real estate agent in the county, and this is Brenda, a senior transition specialist from Sunset Pines. I looked at Mark, a man with too many teeth and a suit that was a little too shiny. Brenda offered a warm, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We just wanted to have a casual conversation, Dad, Daniel said, taking a seat next to Vanessa, just to look at the numbers, to see what makes sense. Have a seat, Harold, Vanessa urged gently. This is a safe space. We all just want what is best for you. I didn't sit down. I stood at the head of the table, resting my hands on the high back of the wooden dining chair. I could feel the heavy brass of Walter's collar resting in my coat pocket. Go ahead, I said quietly. Let's talk about what makes sense. For the next 20 minutes, I listened to a masterclass in manipulation. Mark, the realtor, spoke first. He talked about market trends, low inventory, and the incredible premium buyers were currently paying for properties in my neighborhood. Your house has fantastic bones, Mr. Bennett, Mark said smoothly, tapping a sleek tablet on the table. With a little decluttering, some fresh paint, and the removal of the carpets, we could list it above market value and have a bidding war by the weekend. And that's where I come in, Brenda chimed in, folding her hands sympathetically. Sunset Pines offers a resort-style living experience. You wouldn't have to worry about stairs or maintenance or cooking. We handle everything. And frankly, Harold, without the burden of a large house. And of course, the recent passing of your wife's dog, a pet-free transition would be incredibly seamless for you. My jaw tightened. The recent passing of your wife's dog, is that what Daniel told you? I asked, looking directly at Brenda. That the dog passed away? Brenda blinked, glancing nervously at Daniel. Well, yes, Daniel mentioned this morning that the animal had crossed the Rainbow Bridge. I'm so sorry for your loss. I looked at my son. Daniel swallowed hard, his face flushing a deep, guilty red. He hadn't just abandoned Walter. He had killed him off in conversation to make the transition narrative cleaner for the consultants. Dad, you can't keep living in the past, Daniel said, leaning forward, trying to regain control of the room. The house is too big for you. It's too much upkeep. Mom wouldn't have wanted you to rot in that house alone. Harold, this is about making sure you are safe, Vanessa added, reaching across the table to place her hand over Daniel's. We love you. We worry about you being alone in that house. It's time to downsize. It's time to let us help you manage things. Manage things, I repeated, letting the words roll around in the quiet room. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out the clipboard Vanessa had left on my kitchen counter. I tossed it onto the center of the dining table. It landed with a loud, sharp crack against the polished wood. Vanessa's hand froze. Her eyes locked onto the clipboard, recognizing it instantly. The color began to drain from her face. Is this how you manage things, Vanessa? I asked, my voice deadly calm. What is that? Mark asked, leaning forward to look at the checklist. That, I said, pointing at the clipboard, is a timeline for the hostile takeover of my life. It details exactly how my son and his wife planned to use the equity from my house to pay off Daniel's failing business loans, disguised as a safe transition to a senior living facility. Daniel stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Dad, wait, you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, Daniel, I said, my voice rising just enough to command absolute authority. I understand that you needed $400,000 to clear a personal guarantee. I understand that my house was the only asset large enough to save you from bankruptcy. Brenda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly realizing she had walked into a minefield. Perhaps Mark and I should step outside. Nobody is leaving. A sharp, authoritative female voice echoed from the front hallway. Everyone at the table turned. Walking into the dining room was Evelyn Price, wearing a charcoal gray suit and carrying a thick, dark green folder. Beside her was a man I recognized as Carl Benson, a senior trust officer from the bank Margaret had used for decades. And walking slowly beside them, his heavy red leash held securely in the hands of Clara Ruiz from the animal shelter, was Walter. The old golden retriever clicked across the hardwood floor, his tail wagging slightly as he spotted me. He walked straight past Vanessa, ignoring her completely, and sat down heavily against my leg, leaning his weight into my shin. The silence in the dining room was absolute, suffocating, and loaded with terror. Daniel stared at the dog, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Vanessa looked like she had just seen a ghost. Mark and Brenda, the two professionals hired to facilitate my removal, were staring at Evelyn and Carl with wide, alarmed eyes. Walter, Daniel finally whispered, his voice trembling. How is he here? I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass collar, and dropped it onto the center of the dining table next to the clipboard. You removed his collar this morning because you thought it made him easier to throw away, I said, looking my son dead in the eye. You thought he was just an old, smelly thing tying me to a house you desperately needed to sell. I stepped back, allowing Evelyn to take the floor. Evelyn didn't sit down. She opened the dark green folder, her eyes locking onto Daniel with the terrifying precision of a legal sniper. Daniel Bennett, Evelyn began, her voice ringing clear and cold in the dining room. This morning at 8:15, you attempted to surrender this animal to a county kill shelter. You signed a legal document claiming ownership of the animal, and you falsely stated that the true owner was being moved to an assisted living facility. I was just trying to help my dad, Daniel stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and Evelyn. The dog was a burden. He couldn't take care of it. The dog is not a burden, Daniel, Evelyn said sharply. The dog is protected under a legal trust. Specifically, he is the primary ward of the Margaret Bennett Pet Care Trust. Vanessa scoffed loudly, standing up from the table. The sheer stress of the moment had finally shattered her carefully constructed professional facade. A trust? Vanessa demanded, her voice shrill. Are you kidding me? It is a dog. its dying, incontinent dog. We cannot plan our entire future around an old man and an older dog. The words echoed off the walls. We cannot plan our entire future around an old man and an older dog. She had finally said it out loud, in front of her husband, her real estate agent, and a trust officer. I looked at her, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of validation. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said quietly, the anger in my voice replaced by a cold, untouchable certainty. "Margaret's trust called that exploitation. You just called it your future." Evelyn turned to Carl, the trust officer. Carl stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Mrs. Bennett," Carl said, his tone incredibly dry. "The trust did not ask whether Walter was convenient for your financial planning. It asked whether he was protected. And because he was not, we are here to execute the penalty clauses." Carl looked at Daniel. "Daniel, as of 9 o'clock this morning, when the Riverside Animal Shelter scanned Walter's microchip, an automated legal alert notified Evelyn's office," Carl explained. "The chip didn't execute the trust by itself. It just told us where to look. But the surrender form you signed, that became the documented trigger. Evelyn needed to activate the no abandonment and elder protection clauses embedded in your mother's estate plan." Daniel gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "What does that mean?" Evelyn took over, reading directly from Margaret's signed documents. "It means, Daniel, that your mother anticipated. You might try to exploit your father's grief to gain control of his assets." Evelyn read. "She stipulated that if you ever abandoned her dog, or if you ever attempted to force your father from his primary residence for financial gain, your status as a beneficiary would be immediately suspended." "Suspended?" Daniel choked out. "You can't do that. That's my inheritance. That's my safety net." "It was your safety net," Evelyn corrected him coldly. "But you chose to cut the net when you dumped a 14-year-old dog at a shelter to clear the way for a real estate listing." Evelyn picked up Vanessa's clipboard and held it up. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, "this document detailing a budget designed to pay off your failing business loans using your father's equity constitutes definitive proof of financial exploitation. As the executor of the estate, I am legally obligated to freeze all remaining liquid assets previously earmarked for you, pending a formal review by the sole trustee." Evelyn pointed her pen at me. Daniel looked at me, his eyes wide, panicked, and entirely desperate. "Dad," Daniel pleaded, taking a step toward me. "Dad, please, if I don't get that money, I lose the business. The bank takes this house. They take everything. We were trying to help you. We were trying to get you into a safer place." I looked at the boy I had raised. I looked at the man who had driven my wife's dog to a shelter, signed a piece of paper, and walked away without looking back. "You started by throwing away the one living thing that was helping me, Daniel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet loud enough to fill the entire room. "He was just a dog, Dad," Daniel cried out, his voice cracking. "He's just an animal." "Your mother trusted you with a dog before she trusted you with $1, Daniel," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a register of profound disappointment. I placed my hand on Walter's heavy, golden head. The old dog leaned into my touch, letting out a soft sigh. "Your mother trusted you with a dog before she trusted you with $1, I repeated, my voice steady, delivering the final, crushing blow. "You failed both." The dinner collapsed. Mark, the real estate agent, quietly packed his tablet into his briefcase, refusing to make eye contact with Vanessa. "I think it's best if I remove myself from this listing," Mark muttered, slipping out of the dining room. Brenda stood up, looking horrified. "Mr. Bennett, I assure you." Sunset Pines had no knowledge of this financial arrangement. "We were told you were eager to transition." She didn't wait for a response. She grabbed her purse and followed Mark out the front door. Vanessa stood frozen at the table, her face pale, the reality of her shattered financial future settling heavily over her shoulders. She had played a ruthless game of chess with a grieving widower, and she had just been checkmated by a dead woman and a golden retriever. Daniel sank slowly back into his dining chair, burying his face in his hands. He was bankrupt. He had lost his business. He was likely going to lose his house, and he had just lost his father. I didn't stay to watch him cry. I didn't stay to accept an apology that I knew would only be born out of financial desperation. I picked up Walter's leash from Clara, thanked her softly, and walked out the front door with Evelyn and Carl. Daniel had arrived at dinner expecting me to sign away my house. He left knowing he had signed away his inheritance at an animal shelter. The fallout from the dinner was swift. By Monday morning, Evelyn Price had filed the injunctions. Daniel's beneficiary status was officially suspended. The consequence was catastrophic for his business. Without the impending inheritance acting as a shadow guarantee, his creditors panicked. From what I understood, Daniel and Vanessa were scrambling to list their own house to cover the debt they had planned to dump on me. Vanessa's own meticulous paperwork, the surrender form, the realtor file, the spreadsheet, became the very evidence Evelyn used to freeze them out. Mark and Brenda both submitted written statements confirming they had been lied to. Vanessa had invited them to dinner and accidentally turned them into witnesses. In my house, however, things were quiet. Evelyn fortified my legal protections. The deed was locked into an irrevocable trust. Walter's veterinary care was fully funded by the Pet Care Trust. I changed the locks on the doors and replaced Daniel and Vanessa with Evelyn on my emergency contact list. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt safe. For the first week, Walter startled every time a car door closed outside. He would lift his grey muzzle from Margaret's cardigan, listening for footsteps that might take him away again. Each time, I reached down and touched his collar. "Home!" I would tell him. "You are home!" By the second week, he stopped trembling. 3 weeks after the dinner, the doorbell rang. I was sitting in the blue armchair, reading a book while Walter slept heavily at my feet, his nose pressed against my slipper. I got up, walked to the front door, and looked through the peephole. Daniel was standing on the porch. He was alone. He looked awful. He had lost weight, his suit looked rumpled, and the arrogant corporate swagger he usually carried had completely evaporated. I unlocked the door and opened it, but I left the heavy brass chain attached. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly. He looked at the chain, a flicker of profound embarrassment crossing his face. "Can I come in?" "No, Daniel," I said quietly. "You can't." He swallowed hard, looking down at his shoes. "I know I messed up, Dad. I know what Vanessa and I tried to do was wrong. We were so scared about the money. We panicked." "You didn't panic, Daniel," I corrected him, my tone even. "You planned. You printed spreadsheets. You hired a realtor. You scheduled a carpet cleaner. That wasn't a panic. It was an execution." "I'm sorry," Daniel pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. "I really am. I miss you. I miss Mom." "I miss her too," I said. Daniel looked past me, catching a glimpse of Walter's golden fur through the doorway. The old dog hadn't even bothered to get up. "Dad, I didn't know," Daniel said, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading whisper. "I swear to God, I didn't know Mom put Walter in the trust. If I had known she tied the money to the dog, I never would have taken him to that shelter." I looked at the boy I had raised, feeling a profound, heavy sadness settle into my chest. He still didn't understand. Even after everything, he still thought this was about the legal mechanics of the money. "That is not why you should have brought him home, Daniel," I said softly. Daniel blinked, confused. "What? You are telling me that you would have been kind to an innocent, frightened an animal if you had known you were being paid to do it," I said, my voice hardening. "You are telling me that you would have respected your mother's memory if you had known there was a financial penalty for disrespecting it." "No, that's not what I mean." "It is exactly what you mean," I interrupted, closing the distance between us until I was speaking right through the crack in the door. "You should have brought him home because he was helpless. You should have brought him home because he loved your mother. You should have brought him home because your father was grieving, and taking away my companion was a cruel and heartless thing to do. Daniel stood completely still, his tears freezing on his cheeks. You are not sorry you abandoned him, Daniel, I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. You are sorry abandonment had paperwork. You would have brought him home if money was tied to his collar. That is exactly why your mother tied money to his collar. If Margaret had died penniless, I said, the finality of the words ringing clearly in the cold air. If she hadn't left a single dollar in that trust, it still would not have given you the right to throw away the one thing that was helping me survive. I reached for the door handle. I forgive you for being scared, Daniel, I said quietly. But I do not trust you, and I will not let you back into my life until you figure out the difference between the two. I closed the door, the heavy lock sliding into place with a definitive click. A month later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat in the living room with my 7-year-old grandson, Leo. I allowed Daniel and Vanessa to bring the kids over for supervised visits every other weekend. They were never allowed to stay, and we did not discuss the business, the house, or the trust. I was determined to remain a grandfather, even if I no longer had a son I could rely on. Leo was sitting on the floor next to Walter, gently stroking the old dog's soft graying ears. Walter was completely relaxed, letting out a long, contented sigh as the boy scratched the sweet spot behind his collar. Leo looked up at me, his wide, innocent eyes full of curiosity. "Grandpa?" Leo asked softly. "Yes, buddy. Daddy told Mommy that Grandma left a lot of money for Walter," Leo said, tilting his head. He possessed the blunt honesty that only a 7-year-old could manage. Did Grandma really leave money for a dog? I looked at Walter resting peacefully by Margaret's blue chair. I thought about the heavy, dark green folder sitting in Evelyn Price's office. I thought about the genius of a woman who had known exactly how to protect her family from the grave. I smiled, a warm, peaceful feeling blooming in my chest. "No, sweetheart," I said, leaning down to ruffle Leo's hair. "Your grandma didn't leave money for a dog. She left a test for people." Leo frowned, trying to understand. "Did Daddy pass the test?" "Not this time," I said gently. "But sometimes failing a test is the only way people learn what they actually need to study." I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of Walter's breathing. My son thought he had dumped an old dog. What he had really done was answer the last question his mother ever asked. When love becomes inconvenient, who still protects it? Asterisk, if you were Harold, would you forgive Daniel because he claimed he was trying to help? Or did abandoning Walter prove he was never ready to inherit anything Margaret left behind? Let me know in the comments.